Do you remember last year seeing a video or videos or hearing about these two children making claims that they had been abused sexually and made to participate in ritual killings of babies and a host of other abuses? The Hampstead case. If you don't remember this, you're about to learn more details about this issue than you're likely to find in any other single video. For those that do remember, what was your conclusion? Did you arrive at a conclusion? Or do you remain uncertain of what likely did happen? Do you think when the authorities announce their conclusions in matters like this, those conclusions should be accepted as conclusive by individuals like myself and others? Or do you think each person should arrive at their own conclusions, regardless of any authoritative position? I want to speak just for a moment to all the people who've concluded that the children's claims were false for whatever reason. I don't necessarily disagree with you on that point. I remain very open to the possibility that some elements of their claims were either false or mistaken for whatever reason. More specifically, though, I want to address just those of you who've concluded that not only the bulk of the claims were false, but that the children were encouraged to make those false claims. Once again, that remains a distinct possibility in my opinion. But I want to ask you to approach the issue from a different perspective that I think it will help you to either substantiate your conclusions or show that you may be mistaken. Even though absolute certainty may not be achievable, you may be surprised at how different your views may be at the conclusion of this video. The different perspective I'm suggesting begins by distilling the claims made by the children into their most fundamental and basic form. It sometimes helps to reduce or define things to just what can be shown factually. Not only the claims, but the claimants should be reduced or defined in this way. In this case, the claims were made by two children. They are both human people and British citizens, subject to the law and entitled to legal processes. Most importantly, as to their status or standing, nothing about their being minors in any way limits their standing as British citizens under the law. As to their claims, I admit that many of them are incredible, extraordinary, unprecedented, and even inconceivable. For example, both children claim to have been anally raped by nearly all of the adult figures they come into contact with in the course of their attending Christ Church primary school. And this claim, as well as others, is claimed to be true of other children at the school. In other words, they claim other children have been anally raped by the same adult figures. Another unusual claim they make is that the leader of what they have alluded to being a group acting in a coordinated fashion is the very father of the two children. Another fantastical claim they make is that they have been forced to participate in the killing of human children or infants, and that many among the group of abusers regularly eat the flesh of these murdered children or infants. To make the whole array of claims seem improbable even more to some, they claim these acts of abuse and sadism take place weekly and sometimes more frequently. Other claims they make are less preposterous, while others are equally or more so. But my suggestion is that it's possible to reduce the claims to something more elementary for the purposes of reevaluation. As I said, doing this may help you to see this issue from a new perspective. At the core of the claims made by the two children are sexual abuse, which included rape and multiple homicide. Does that seem reasonable to you? If not, then you may remain influenced by the particulars. In this exercise, though, neither the particulars or the veracity of the claims is important in the slightest and should be ignored. Let me give you a very basic example. Let's say a child makes the claim to authorities that they have been anally raped. Does it matter whether the accused rapist is a computer programmer from Birmingham or an unknown person dressed like Ronald McDonald? A claim is a claim under the law. Only upon investigating the claim may a decision be made as to whether the claim warrants an arrest. Only facts that are uncovered through investigation may be used to determine the legitimacy of the claim. This may not be the process you agree with, but it appears to be the legal process nonetheless. So once again, I suggest the claims can be distilled and reduced to those of sexual abuse, including rape, and multiple homicide. Now that we have established what the claims can be reduced to, let's consider another aspect of this issue that we may as well be able to reduce, I guess, to a more simplified form. I'm referring to the subsequent investigation and legal proceedings. I've already mentioned that claims require substantiation through investigation. And although we're making the assumption that the basic elements of the issue as reported are factual, we've conclusively established that 2 British citizens have made claims of both sexual abuse and multiple homicide. Now we can look into what happened next. This is where I suspect your understanding of the issue may be lacking, and where crucial details can help us to easily make a determination as to whether the legal processes were carried out properly and whether an investigation took place at all. It might also help us, or it might also lead us to determine whether corruption or crimes of state played any role in this. Let's begin by tracking the events that took place in response to the claims, just slightly backwards to how the claims were officially made. On December 5th, 2014, Ella Draper and her 2 children, Alyssa and Gabriel, traveled to the Colindale police station and asked to report their claims. This generated a crime report document, or a CRIS, a CRIS. Ella reported on this occasion that she was also in possession of, quote, lots of evidence, including videos, diary pages, and drawings. The police didn't then and haven't since asked for that evidence. Ella did present them with cell phone video evidence which depicted both children giving details related to the claims, which was taken into police custody. What has since been learned is that on that very day that Ella presented this video evidence, it was immediately sent miles away to a police property storage facility in Chingford, where it remains unexamined to this day. The significance of this will become more clear as I provide further details. Let's stop here and take a moment to assess a couple factors that are important to take into consideration. First, it should be noted that the mother and the children did, in fact, officially make these claims in person at the Colindale police station. These claims weren't made through a form on the internet, or through the mail, or by telephone. This indicates an intent to be forthright and a willingness to be scrutinized to whatever degree. We should also note that on the very day these claims were made, the authorities acted in ways that were either unprofessional or not in keeping with normal procedures. To put things into perspective and get a better sense of the scope of the investigation and the overall case, the crime report was officially created on the 5th of September. The case was subsequently closed on the 22nd of September. So everything we're going to review related to how the claims were dealt with takes place in the span of 2.5 weeks. Afterwards, we'll review the involvement of child services agencies and the high courts. On September 11th, in response to the claims that were made by both children were taken into custody by child services. That was the last day that their mother, Ella Draper, had any communication with them. The next significant event related to the case were the physical examinations of both children conducted by consultant pediatrician Dr. Hodes on the 12th and the 16th of September. I want to be as clear as possible here when I state that Dr. Hodes concluded from the examinations and review of the children's medical histories that the anal scarring found on both Gabriel and Alyssa, quote, further confirm the allegations of inflicted anal injury from insertion of a blunt, penetrative force, and that the fissures are consistent with the children's allegations of sexual abuse, unquote. Dr. Hodes is a consultant pediatrician with over 30 years experience in pediatrics and nearly 40 years as a doctor. So, to take stock again, we now have a case where 2 British citizens have made claims of sexual abuse, including rape, and multiple homicide that resulted in a consultant pediatrician's official opinion that there is physical, bodily evidence consistent with the sexual abuse allegations. Boy, this is a breeze. It couldn't be any simpler. It makes me wonder whether I myself might be an expert criminal investigator. But that seems very unlikely, so why is it that I'm able to very easily come to understand the nature of this case, when the actual investigators involved in it cannot? The next event of significance involves the father of the children, a Mr. Ricky Dearman. The father was separated from the mother and wasn't a part of the household. It wasn't a part of their household. He wasn't a part of the household for a long time, including the time of the incident. He did have very infrequent visitation with the children during the time the children alleged the abuse took place and at the time that they made their official claim. It's also important to note here that Dr. Hodes provided his initial conclusions from the examinations that were conducted on the 12th to the police on the 15th. It was also on the 15th that Mr. Dearman was interviewed by police. Now, the CRIS, or crime report, confirmed that Mr. Dearman, one of the alleged abusers, was to be arrested. However, inexplicably, Mr. Dearman was instead invited for a caution +3 interview at Collindale Police Station, even though the arrest criteria had been satisfied. He has never been arrested for the allegations and was free to leave the police interview at Collindale Police Station at any time. Mr. Dearman was interviewed by one Constable Savage. At a later fact-finding hearing, Savage stated that the reason Mr. Dearman was not arrested was because the arrest criteria had not been satisfied. This was in clear contradictions to what the CRIS report at that time said. Justice Poffley, however, accepted this incorrect explanation. Now, the children were interviewed on 3 occasions, each by officials investigating the case, okay? Videos of these interviews have been leaked to the public, and I have watched them a number of times. I did so looking specifically for signs of both competent interview technique and anything that would be deemed improper or incompetent. I was also paying close attention to the behavior of the children as well as the exact testimony they gave. If you haven't seen these videos or don't know the key role they played, the first 2 interviews contain the children's allegations, and the interview primarily explores and attempts to clarify those allegations. The third and final interview contains what can be deemed as a full retraction in a way. However, technically, neither child fully retracts each specific allegation, nor do they broadly retract the entirety of their claims. Because it's not relevant to this exercise at this point, in which we're simply assessing the investigation and the legal processes that took place, I'm going to intentionally ignore the details of these interviews, especially what was said by the children. The only aspect I think is important to consider is the retraction factor. Normally, a retraction being made well into the investigation is significant in really 2 ways. It primarily will result in the end of any attempts to uncover further evidence that isn't already part of the body of the case. It will also, if it applies, result in the release of suspects from any further inquiry. However, in no case does a retraction trigger a case to be closed automatically, nor does it absolve anyone from any crimes that may have been committed. And depending upon the case, sufficient evidence of a crime, or at least enough to warrant pursuing a trial, exists, and the case remains open. I think this case is an example of one in which too much evidence was already on the table to simply allow retractions to nullify that evidence. The last aspect of these interviews that I think is relevant is the handling of the third interview of both children on the part of the police. It's a factor totally unrelated to the testimony given by the children. The officer who conducted the interviews is one Constable Steve Martin. It was learned after the case was closed that Constable Martin was, at the time of the interviews he conducted, the almoner of the East Barnet Freemasonic Lodge. According to the almoner's handbook, Martin would be the lodge's eyes and ears. A good almoner needs to maintain contact with lodge members, including those who are not regular attendees, and with widows and dependents of former members. He needs to be alert to problems they may face. and aware of the range of support that can be called upon to address them. At the same time, he needs to be discreet in carrying out his role, with the result that its significance may not always be fully appreciated. Since the closing of the case, Martin was said to have been promoted to treasurer for the lodge, but I haven't confirmed that detail as of yet. Specific to the third interviews of the children, Constable Martin conducted himself in a distinctly different manner that I'm not surprised few, if any, people noticed. In the case of the first two interviews, once a question had been asked by Martin and a response given, he would frequently ask clarifying questions, the point of which was obviously to make sense of the response or to better establish the facts and the meaning of the testimony. During the third interview, Constable Martin asked significantly fewer clarifying questions. This indicated to me that the specific details behind the retractions were not experiential, and therefore less questioning of these details took place so as not to complicate or discredit those retractions. In other words, had the children been influenced to retract their allegations, the details of how their earlier claims were now to be found as false would have been learned by the children only through direction and not experienced by them. Is it against protocol to intentionally focus on supporting details that validate the retraction and ignore others that might conflict or nullify them? I'm not sure, but the bottom line is that Constable Martin conducted the third interviews differently than he had the first two. During the second interview of Gabriel, only 25 minutes into the interview, Constable Martin asked to be excused and did excuse himself and never concluded that interview. After an hour and a half had passed, he returned to begin Alyssa's second interview. What prompted this interruption? It was already late in the evening when he cut the interview short. Is it possible that some detail uncovered during that interview led Martin to seek advice or to inform other parties? He has not yet explained the interruption. Returning to the interview of the children's father, who happens to be one of the accused abusers, on the 15th of September, the transcript has become available and I have examined it. One thing that I noted as immediately striking was the uncommonly cordial and even apologetic nature of the questioning. But that isn't necessarily proof of conspiracy or a cover-up. However, the questions that were asked were inexplicable. For some reason, only questions related to possible abuse occurring at Finchley Lido swimming pool were asked. Absolutely none of the children's other extensive allegations were brought up, nor was Mr. Dearman questioned about any of them. This is a serious and highly suspicious matter that seems impossible to reconcile, considering what was already established in the case by that time. Making the matter even more relevant is what Mr. Dearman stated in an interview by Victoria Derbyshire of the BBC on the 20th of April 2015. When asked by Miss Derbyshire what the police had said that he was being accused of, his response was, and I'm going to attempt to stay as close to verbatim as possible here, quote, "They said, and I am okay with what they said. It was more that it's come from my children. They said that I'm the leader of a satanic sex cult, pedophile ring, and there's 100 and plus involvement in this, including CAF, CASS, the police, social services, schools, and I am the leader of this, and I am sat across, and they are recording this. I'm sat there across from the table from the police officer asking the questions, and I don't know how to answer that." Pardon me. Okay, whether Mr. Dearman intentionally lied or was completely mistaken in his remembrance of his interview by police, that statement was entirely false. Not a single element of what he stated comports with the transcript of the interview. In my opinion, it's unbelievable that he could be so confused about what the police said and asked of him. Therefore, it's more likely that Mr. Dearman was simply lying to elicit sympathy from the BBC audience or for other unknown reasons. Lying in such a brazen way as he had caused me to have my first suspicion that Mr. Dearman was possibly involved in a cover-up, further supporting the allegations against him and the others. Some might argue that this isn't enough to foster suspicions of Mr. Dearman, but other factors contributed to my opinion. One factor is how I learned Mr. Dearman became aware of the official claims having been brought against him. Rather than the police visiting him directly or simply making contact with him on the telephone, it was the child services that contacted him, alerting him. I can't say whether this did in fact benefit Mr. Dearman in some way, maybe providing him the time to prepare for an arrest and questioning that was sure to follow. But remember that while Mr. Dearman was slated for arrest, according to the official report, the police opted instead for merely a voluntary interview. When looked at in total, I see many reasons to doubt that Mr. Dearman was truly subject to any investigation or at risk of being charged for any crimes. But it gets much worse, though, when we look more broadly at the scope of the investigation. I've explained that the investigation lasted only 2.5 weeks. While the children's allegations included exactly specifying upwards of 15 individuals that had sexually abused or otherwise tortured them, along with other crimes, none of those individuals were questioned. While they claimed abuse had occurred at no less than 4 specific locations that were known by authorities or could have been identified with great ease, none were visited even once. While the allegations indicated that other sources of evidence that could have existed through alternate means, such as CCTV footage, and most especially cell phone records, no other evidence was sought. Not one person was even contacted by telephone. These points alone indicate an appalling level of either incompetence or a concerted effort to cover up crimes which in fact had occurred. On September the 22nd of 2014, after conducting 2 separate examinations of both children and having earlier produced preliminary conclusions in the case, Dr. Hodes provided the final medical assessment showing inflicted anal injury from insertion of a blunt penetrative force consistent with the children's allegations of sexual abuse. This final assessment also included the details of the fissures that were observed. Now, what was provided by Dr. Hodes in the assessment is one thing, and what was included in the Chris report was another. It was apparently this flexibility in what was required to be included in the report that led to the investigation being closed on that very day, the 22nd. Ultimately, as the Chris report was being updated with the details emerging from the investigation, Detective Inspector John Cannon, who was leading the investigation, noted in the report that Dr. Hodes and a Dr. Fernandez were conferring about the details and that the report would be amended later. The report was not amended, and Dr. Hodes' conclusions were not included in the report. However, one Dr. Fernandez does include in the report the opinion that, quote, a large solid poo could be the possible cause of anal scarring. So for whatever reason, only this solid poo possibility was thought to be worth noting in the report, which may have been the point at which the decision was made to close the case by Inspector Cannon, which did happen that day. Dr. Fernandez does make one amendment to the report related to the fissures described by Dr. Hodes. Fernandez notes that it's, quote, possible they are irregularities that could be a normal variant. Not probable, highly improbable, but possible. Now fast forward to the hearing on March 19th, 2015, during which Judge Poffley issues a judgment in the case. Poffley states in her judgment that Dr. Hodes' findings were, quote, significantly amended, unquote, at a peer-reviewed meeting, presumably with Dr. Fernandez. She states further that, quote, I was perturbed that Dr. Hodes was prepared to conclude and then confirm the presence of fissures when subsequent peer review resulted in them being described as a normal variant. Did you catch that? Did you note the difference there? Specifically, which word had been left out? The word left out was possible. The report stated that it was possible the fissures were a normal variant. So it appears there was nothing significantly amended, However, Judge Poffley stated that it was, while also choosing to omit the word possible, entirely reframing the assessment of what had caused the fissures. Now, it might have been easier for all parties involved to simply go to the children's testimonies to gain a better understanding of these injuries. They had described being anally raped by Mr. Hollings and the others, with both real and plastic willies, how they, quote, both experienced bleeding from their bottoms afterwards, and were given wet tissue to wipe the blood, or sometimes white stuff that came from the willy. Now, in reading the various comments shared by members of Ella Draper's legal team, it's clear that they've all experienced horrendous misuse of power and clear injustices. I can only conclude that they are intentional events that, when combined, have effectively shut down this case and silenced the accusers and those that represent them. I could list dozens of examples of this, but will just cite one to make the case before concluding this analysis and report. By law, both the local authorities and any counsel for other parties have the right to all evidence in the case, especially the actual case reports. A member of Miss Draper's counsel happened to inquire with Miss Markham, the counsel for the local authority, about the volume of redactions in her copy of the Chris report. She confirmed that the Chris report she has is redacted at pages 65 through 67. They then emailed her back informing her that the Chris report they have had was redacted at pages 11, 17, 28, 30, 33, 46 through 67, 71, and 74. Ms. Markham has since failed to respond, despite numerous requests. This is entirely improper. It only hints at the fullness of the corruption. So let's take final stock of what we're now left with, and after a year has passed since the children's claims were officially made. And as I intended from the start, we're only going to be concerned with the fundamental nature of the claims that were made and the subsequent investigation and legal proceedings that were undertaken. I think we've done a fantastic job of determining with certainty that the claims made were absolutely worthy of investigation, as well as most likely justifying even extended means being undertaken to uncover any crimes that may have taken place. To the issue of whether the investigation was sufficiently carried out, there can only be a dispute on the basis of a technicality. Was there some underlying factor or detail in either the claims themselves or anything learned during the pathetically insufficient investigation that would justify how lacking it was and ultimately the closure of the case? That isn't something I can answer. But as a human being and someone with common sense, which I'm sure many of you have as well, it seems beyond reason and unthinkable and disgusting that essentially no investigation was carried out whatsoever. The detractors, whom I might add, demonstrate that they are vile, petty, uncaring, and barely human, have and will continue to point to ridiculous aspects of the children's lives, such as the mother's boyfriend Abraham being a proponent of hemp extracts for various health and medical uses. They argue that because Abraham and Ella were feeding the children oatmeal containing hemp oil that contained none of the psychoactive elements of marijuana, the pleas of the children to be protected from abusers that anally rape them and force them to participate in grisly atrocities can be dismissed as fantasy. Clearly, then, it was the drug-pushing boyfriend that programmed the children with an enormous volume of detail relating to events that never happened. I've seen personally how intelligent and well-meaning people have easily dismissed the entire issue as nothing more than a disgruntled spouse concocting the whole scenario in order to prevent Mr. Dearman from any parental rights. Never have I heard them elaborate on their theory, certainly nothing to explain how absolutely bizarre their theory is. Can vindictiveness, even in the most extreme cases, cause someone to become insane for an extended period without exhibiting their break from reality in other areas of their life? Some have argued, rather rudely and dismissively, that the claims made by the children of some abusers wearing shoes made from baby skin, or that the abuse sometimes occurred upstairs in the storage area of a local McDonald's restaurant, completely discredits the entirety of their claims. Almost never do they express concern for what the effects of having been somehow forced to make false claims might be. To them, the matter is settled, and everyone should move on with a chuckle as they did. Do they have these ideas because they are psychopathic and incapable of truly empathizing with others, even children? Or is their conscience incapable of conceiving that the very most respected members of a society might in truth be the most horrible among us? And if they were true, wouldn't that be extremely convenient? After all, you and I aren't granted the authority to absolve ourselves from accounting for our actions. Neither do we possess the authority to ignore demands that we comply with the law. Who among us thinks that if a child were to accuse us of having raped them repeatedly, we might somehow be left totally unchallenged? Personally, I would be very interested in what motivated the child to make such a claim, and might even offer assistance that might lead to resolving whatever trouble they might be facing. I've had associates say that they've come to the determination that the whole event was an operation of sorts, intended to discredit the alternative news, or specifically the 9/11 Truth Movement. In their opinion, in the establishment's lust for silence dissent, even children can be used to trick people into revealing themselves as having no discernment skills and ultimately being a danger to society. What I would suggest those people consider is the very recent history of child abuse still unfolding in Britain. And I'd venture to say that Jimmy Savile wasn't limiting himself to merely sexual abuse of minors. After all, he was very involved in contributing to agencies caring for the feeble or disabled, even so much as to be present at their establishments frequently, having rooms assigned to his use, and even being given the keys to the facility. It's possible that his demented acts weren't limited even to the living. He was known to request he be allowed to transport the dead from hospitals to the mortuary. And it wasn't only Savile that carried out abuse of this kind. Not only have other parties been either accused of abuse or convicted of abuse, but very often the accused or convicted are very prominent figures. Most of these characters were former or current employees of government. And it's not insignificant to note that Savile in particular was a close friend of the royals. In fact, when no one else was thought to be a close enough friend to spend the Christmas holiday with, Jimmy Savile was. I make no claim to being more informed of the details of this case than others looking into it from the outside. I don't have any personal knowledge of the parties involved and haven't had communication with them. I've never even been to England and have a limited concept of what the Hampstead area is like or the culture one might find there. I freely admit that the allegations may be false in large part or in total even. However, that's not to say that I'm wrong and they are false. I think those kids told the truth. Maybe it was at a moment at which they understood that the balance between the threat of horrible punishment and the potential of being free, like most children again, had evened out. So given other conditions that kind of encouraged them to tell these secrets, they took a chance. If that is what happened, and they have told the truth, what the fuck are you doing about it? I'm not truly admonishing everyone not fully engaged in this issue. But if you're someone who has read up on this or followed these events and now sit idle, you understand what you're doing, right? I know we're all under the spell of the dark machinery of this advanced world. But even if not intellectually, then at least on some humane, ethical level, you have to know that there is suffering at all times. We've all seen the photo of that black child coiled over from exhaustion and starvation with that vulture lurking behind. So we pick up the child and watch the vulture fly away, and we feed him. Problem solved. At least one problem. That child is long dead. To solve this problem would require only that the police actually conduct an investigation like any other, following the protocols they're well familiar with. How we force that to take place, I can't say for sure, but we're talking about it. It hangs over our heads, but we're talking about it. I said before that this shit ain't over, and this shit ain't over. Thank you.